Several weeks ago, in the lead up to this important event, I received an email from my colleague, Dr. Kasiboni. I opened the email and found a link to an interesting article published by one of the most prestigious publishers entitled Racial Inequality in Journals. This title immediately caught my attention, so I decided to download the article. I tried several times, but I couldn't, only to realize that I had no access to this journal. I strongly believe that the title of the article and my ordeal, to a very great extent, reflect on the topic of today's event. And to a larger extent, it also reflects on the entire seminar series. The title of today's event is Barriers to Accessing Journals in Africa and the Global South. The seminar seeks to engage the challenges that academics and students encounter while accessing journals for research and reading purposes. On this note, I would like to welcome our participants, those that are here physically and those who have joined us virtually. My name is Oluwaseun Tella. I'm the head of the Future of Diplomacy at the Institute for the Future of Knowledge at the University of Johannesburg. Today's seminar is the first in a series of seminars that focus on democratization of knowledge, the politics and economics of knowledge production and consumption. Today's seminar, it's quite important, and it seeks to look at how students and academics actually are challenged in their attempts to conduct research, and also when they intend to just read journal articles. And this series, it's organized jointly by the Institute for the Future of Knowledge and the University of Johannesburg's library. And I'm glad that this series boasts of distinguished academics, one of whom I personally regard as University of Johannesburg's Jeffrey Bill. This event also boasts of the youngest PhD graduate in Africa, as well as a distinguished academic who is currently the editor of one of the most prestigious journals in South Africa. On this note, I would like to invite Dr. Kasiboni and Professor Van Ham to present and deliver their opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tella. Good afternoon, everyone. As introduced earlier, my name is Anthony Kasiboni, Head of Research at the Institute for the Future of Knowledge. The Institute for the Future of Knowledge is one of the university's flagship institutes, established with a specific research focus to generate world-class research rooted in African realities. At the IFK, we're committed to pioneering research in sustainability and the fourth industrial revolution. By that, we also delve deep into profound epistemological questions at the heart of knowledge. So we ask, what is knowledge? Who decides what qualifies as valid knowledge? By what and whose right? How is knowledge valued? Who determines what is deemed worth knowing? These are crucial inquiries we grapple with because we encounter power asymmetries, and contestations that echo the complexities of our social existence and the fabric of knowledge production. Today, we come together to confront our moral obligation. As students, academics, policymakers, business leaders, and individuals in strategic positions, we understand knowledge's vital role in shaping our world. However, we also acknowledge that the terrain of knowledge creation and dissemination is far from equitable. There are systematic disadvantages that persist. Reflecting on my own academic journey, I can't help but recall how in my undergraduate students, as a sociologist, I was introduced to the discipline through the lens of the French philosopher Auguste Comte, hailed as the father of sociology. Only later, during my postgraduate studies, with a woke lecturer, did I unearth the rich African roots of the discipline. Credits to the Islamic scholar Ibn Khaldun. Such oversights and imbalances need redress. And as we explore the concept of democratizing knowledge, we must be attentive to the voices of the global South, post-colonial and subaltern populations. Our students deserve a more profound connection to the knowledge they draw from, one that reflects their diverse experiences and perspectives. Similarly, our academics grapple with the daunting phase, publish or perish, a daunting expectation that often demands unsustainable volume of publication in peer-reviewed journals, most of which that are based in the global North. We cannot ignore that many of these journals are in global Northern countries, leading to an uneven representation of issues and problems worldwide. Some require exorbitant publication fees, unreachable to academics and universities in the South. So the question arises, how do we engage with this knowledge divide? Who are the knowledge producers and consumers? How do they relate? How do you address the pressing global challenges when knowledge is not equally accessible and fairly represented? Today, as we embark on this quest to democratize knowledge, I urge you to embrace the spirit of inclusivity and equity. Let us collectively commit to breaking down the barriers that confine knowledge to specific geographies and perspectives. Let us advocate for the recognition of diverse voices, especially those from marginalized communities who bring unique insights to the table. Professor Maria, over to you.
Thank you. So, hello everyone. It's lovely to be with those of you that are here in person and also with everybody who's joining us online. So my name is Maria Framop and I'm the Executive Director here in the library. And I'm also a Professor of Religion Studies in the Department of Religion Studies here at the university. And one of my big challenges as head of a library is how do we make information accessible to everybody and all the different disciplines that are in the university? In other words, how do we stretch our budgets? So the idea of open access seemed incredibly appealing. But now open access is coming with another big price tag, article processing fees. So in some ways, we have got certain things for free, inverted commas, i.e. people anywhere in the world can access this information. Yet on the other hand, being able to produce that information is costing us an enormous amount. And so I think it is time for us in different ways to really think about the knowledge production and the cost of knowledge production and the purpose of knowledge production. Who is consuming this knowledge and why? What are they going to do with the knowledge that we have produced? And how can we in the global South be speaking back to many of the normative ideas in the global North that have got us into a position where we talk about open access as free information? And just now, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about that and how we unpack what we mean by transformative agreements, what we mean by open access, and what we are trying to achieve with an idea of free access to information. So thank you very much for joining today. And I hope you can join us for our sessions over the next 2 weeks as we continue to unpack this very complex issue from a variety of different angles. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Casaboni and Professor Maria, for giving us a solid context to the seminar series. At this junction, I would like to introduce and invite the speakers. Our first speaker is Professor Maria from HAP, who serves as the Executive Director, Library and Information Center at UJ. I think you can tell why I refer to him as Jeffrey Bell. The second speaker is Professor Chris Isike, who is the professor of African Politics and International Relations in the Department of Political Sciences at the University of Pretoria. He's also the director of the African Center for the Study of the United States at the University of Pretoria. Additionally, he is the editor of one of South Africa's most prestigious journals, Politicon. So colleagues, if there's anyone amongst you whose paper has been recently rejected by Politicon, you don't need to send an email to the journal. The editor is here. The final speaker is Professor Musa Wenkosi Samrumbe, who is an associate professor in industrial psychology and people management here at UJ. It will interest you to know that this professor holds the record as the youngest female PhD graduate in Africa, achieving this milestone at 23 years old. Prof. Maria.
So I have a PowerPoint that I would like to share. Okay, I'm going to look in a little bit more detail at the economic cost of knowledge production and consumption. And what I'm looking at is that we need to have impactful, sustainable research, and that this research needs to be accessible to people. And I'm going to look a little bit at the pressures on research and funding in South Africa, and then some thoughts, but sadly not real answers, for achieving a sustainable open access research environment. So if we look at Africa in particular, we have 4 different players on the field. We have researchers, publishers, the users of this information, and of course the funders. And all of these 4 groups, I think, really need to work together to create information that has an impact for the positive good of society. So we have talked at universities for doing research for research's sake, and there's been a big move to doing research because of its societal impact. But when we look at Africa, this actually becomes an incredibly important issue, because many governments and NGOs make their decisions based on the research that is available. That's not surprising. What is, though, surprising is how few of them actually have access to enough funds to buy really good research. So if you are making your decisions based on available data, your policies, etc., as NGOs and governments in Africa, but you are not able to access the latest or best information, you've got a little bit of a problem. So if you've ever wondered why we seem to be implementing things that are 10 years out of date in Africa, one of the reasons is those people who make these policies don't always have access to the information. We then came up with this wonderful idea for open access. And the idea here was that publishers have a monopoly on journals, and this should be dealt with. Publishers were selling us bundles of journals, so we in the library seldom buy an individual journal. We generally buy bundles of journals that the publishers force us to buy, some of which we don't necessarily use very much. The idea with open access was that market forces would then be able to regulate the cost of these publishers. In other words, how much these publishers were charging, because the cost that publishers were charging libraries for journals and these bundles was going up and up and up exponentially. But there's also an increasing number of journals. And so a lot of big mergers were taking place. So lots of little journals were getting merged into these big publishers who then had a monopoly and could charge whatever they wanted. Then the digital landscape came along and publishers decided to create these big deals in which they bundled lots and lots of journals together, which we then had to buy as libraries with little choice for us. And if you're in the library, one of the things you would be interested in is that we often lost the back file. So you would buy a journal for a year, and then you wouldn't have the journal forever, as you did in the form of the hard copy. All different ways in which publishers were making ever more money. So as a person who was an academic and only came to the library 5 years ago, I remember going to my first library ever conference and just being shocked at the amount of money that there was. I was used to going to academic conferences. You know, we pay for this with our own research funds, we go there, and everything is done on a shoestring because we don't really have very much money. And suddenly I was there and all these publishers are having a cocktail party here and a dinner there. And I was just like, oh, so that's where all the money goes. And I, was really starting to get a little bit hot under the collar by the end of the conference. But then we, in our academic world, have the idea of publish or perish. And so we have this growing demand for journals without actually a growing need for the journals. So lots of people don't even read what we publish. And so this is a very unusual market, as Thomaselli says. And then, of course, within the Department of Higher Education and Training in South Africa, we've created something of a rent seeker culture because you get paid for everything that you write. Open access was supposed to be a way to regulate this. It was supposed to be a way to offer free access to information for readers. It was also supposed to be a way in which publishers would be brought back into some kind of check. Now, open access hasn't really fulfilled everything that we'd hoped it would do. So some editors have even gone so far as to resign from their positions in order to put pressure on publishers and say that not only must these articles be free to read, they must also be, if not completely free, then at a very affordable price for people to publish in them. Now, one of the other things that obviously drives the open access market is because governments, particularly governments like the British government or the German government, were saying, well, actually, we've already funded all this research. Why do we then have to pay for our citizens to be able to access it? And so they put a lot of pressure on publishers to also create an environment for open access. And then, of course, there are challenges here for the less established journals. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but just to say that what we really landed up doing with Plan S, which was one of the big open access publishing discussions, was to flip the way that we pay. So instead of paying to read something, we now have a situation in which we pay to publish in something. Of course, in the global south, this has created a lot of problems. Firstly, there is a desperate need for knowledge production from the global south. Take, for example, Southern Africa. We're not going to solve our problems by reading things that happened in Germany. That's really not going to help us, whether it's medical or political or whatever the case may be. We need our own knowledge production system. But with the growing unaffordability of making research available, i.e. platforms for us to publish in, we have a new challenge in the global south. So another one of the problems with open access has been that it actually hasn't significantly increased the citation rates. A lot of people are saying, well, now with open access, taxpayers are paying for us to publish, which is a whole different debate. And then, of course, there are predatory journals. So if you give a paper somewhere and then you get an email that says that was such an interesting paper, we are so enamored by the work you do, please will you publish with us? It is the predatory journal. Nobody ever tells you that you're fabulous in the academic world. Right, so our knowledge production cycle, I don't want to go into this in any great detail, but if we are going to, in the humanities, for example, have an average cost of 14,000 Rand for an academic journal, you can see that that alone is already quite steep. At UJ, the average cost of APCs for last year was 38,000 Rand for a journal article. And in the health sciences, the average that we paid for article processing fees, so that all costs, APCs, was 60,247 Rand for every article last year. So if you look at those figures and you see how much we get from DHEAD for every article that gets published, you can see that we're starting to face a new problem. We also work in a system in which higher education is under an enormous amount of strain. I'm not going to go into this, you all know this too well. And what do we use our money for? So this incentive money from DHEAD for publication is not really used for research. It's basically used to keep the lights on. And we're lucky if 20 or 25% of that money really goes back into the research system in any significant way. So I have done a very, very crude calculation here based on the humanities and what colleagues tell me within the humanities. So if you were going to be a professor in the humanities and you went to two conferences a year, one national and one international, and you paid to have two of your articles edited, and then you paid for article processing costs, and then you had a little bit of extra money to pay about 50,000 Rand for some students to help you with some field work. The total cost of all of this will be about 210,000 Rand. We get, for two journal articles from DHEAD, about 240,000 Rand. That leaves us about 30,000 Rand for the institution to keep the university going. So you can see here where the problem in the system is. We do not have a system in which we can afford to start paying huge article processing fees, even if you're going to be something as lean as research within the humanities. If you're going to run a journal, a very lean independent journal, so I'm not talking about a journal with Brill or Taylor and Francis where you don't have to pay article processing fees. This is data that I get from our UJ Press, where we've got 18 different journals on our platform. So you would need to have a hosting platform, then you've got layout and editing fees, then you've got to have searchability. And so you're looking at about 160,000 Rands worth of money that you need to get in every year to run your little journal. If you have, for example, 14 different articles and you charge people about 10,000 Rand per article, you're not going to cover your costs. The point I'm trying to make here is that the production of knowledge is not free. Making knowledge available is not free. So while we shout at the publishers and say that they are being exorbitant, I am not saying that we can ever be in a world where making knowledge available for people in a searchable way that is cataloged, etc., can ever be done for free. You can't run a journal for free unless you want nobody to read it. Then of course you can do that. Okay, but if you want something that has quality, that people can find, it is going to cost you something. So I get quite upset when people start talking about free information. There is nothing free about doing research. Doesn't come at a zero cost. There is nothing free about publishing information. So somewhere, somehow, in this landscape that we find ourselves in, we need to find a new way to talk about how we produce our knowledge and how we make that knowledge available to people. And we have to do it in a more realistic way. Yes, it does mean that we have to fight back at these publishers with their huge fees that they are charging us. But we can't ever get to a point where we say that there's going to be no fee for the publishing of a journal. Whether that should be in a pay to read by paying libraries, or one of the things that we've come up with now are transformative agreements. And I know that I'm running out of time, so I'm going to do this as simply and as quickly as I can. So what publishers are doing now is, on the one hand, they are saying, okay, here is the bundle of journals that you used to buy from us. 20% of these have now become open access. And so sometimes you're very lucky, and those open access journals you don't have to pay for. But most of the time, it means that the university, generally the library, will have to pay for the cost of those article processing fees. So it appears to authors as though those journals are free when it is being paid for out of the library budget. And what we are doing is literally transforming, instead of paying to read something, the library is paying X amount because they know that with Taylor and Francis, about 100 people at the university are going to write an article. I'm making it very simple. It's more complicated than that, but I don't want to take too long. So let's look at what this looks like. So let's say the library used to spend 100,000 Rand in a pay-to-read subscription. Now 30% of their journals are open access, and article processing fees cost about 30 Rand an article. So the publishers say to us, right, because some things are open access, we're going to bring our subscription down to 180,000 Rand, but we're still going to charge you 30,000 Rand for article processing fees. So in the end, the library is now spending 110,000 Rand. The problem with the setup is that this is a more than 4% increase. And most libraries at the moment are looking at a 0% increase or at best 4% increase. So we now have to find money we currently don't have. And I want to talk about scholars in the Global South. So unless we change these article processing fees, and we find a way to put pressure on publishers that we, yes, pay to publish with them if that's the way we're going to do things, and there are great advantages for us in the Global South if we enable that. It has to be in a way that we in the Global South can still publish in high impact journals that are international and where we are not excluded from the world of publishing because we can't afford to pay for the article processing fees. And if we don't do this, then our academic freedom, our ability to produce and consume knowledge will be taken away from us because it is simply unaffordable. Thank you very much.
Professor Maria, thank you for your excellent presentation. If I were to summarize your presentation, I would say, when it comes to publication, there's no mahala.
That's it.
I think you have skillfully taken us through the economies of publication. And I'm open, as I invite Professor Chris Isike, that as a political scientist, you take us through the political dimension of publication. I will also be interested in knowing whether you are representing the Department of Political Sciences or the Embassy of the United States. I beg your pardon, the African Center for the Study of the United States. Professor Isike.
Thank you very much, Dr. Teller. When you said you were going to summarize our talk, I was asking myself, why would he want to summarize the talk we all had, right? This is what chairpersons do. But then I knew that there was a trap. He was going to trap me to set me up. He knew deliberately that I represent both the Department of Political Sciences, the University of Pretoria. I'm not representing the African Center for the Study of the United States because everybody tell me these days that I speak for the United States even though they don't give me any money. But I think that I would want to say I accepted this invitation because I'm editor of Politicom. It is the biggest political science journal in Africa, not just in South Africa. And the fact that I'm a member of the National Scholarly Editors Forum in ASAF, so I thought I've been through it enough to put thoughts together, which I'm willing to share. And so everything I'm going to be saying is based on knowledge generated from my membership of the NSEF. And indeed, yes, it's correct, Teller, that there is a politics of knowledge production and consumption. There is indeed a gap in knowledge production and consumption between Africa and the global north. And sadly, even within the global south itself that Africa belongs to, we are still marginal players. And so the question is why, right? I'm just going to do two things, talk about, in trying to look at barriers to accessing journals in Africa and the global south. I will talk about some challenges and then talk about, possible opportunities or inclusive solutions, as you guys wanted me to do. So in talking about the challenge, I like to always say from the very beginning, because we always talk about what universities do. We speak about decolonizing, decoloniality, and talk about all these things universities are supposed to do, as if universities themselves are authorities unto themselves. Universities are microcosms within the larger macrocosm of the state. And so any kind of discussion or analysis that does not factor the state and the role of the state in any kind of knowledge production, dissemination enterprise is actually problematic. So my first challenge, and this is where I go into the politics of it, is the structure of higher education in Africa, right? What is the structure? By structure, I mean, the whole regimen of rules, of funding, of constitution, of government, and what they are supposed to be doing. So basically, we know that poor funding impacts on accessibility of research. How? Because if government don't fund education, and especially higher education in this instance, it will impact on not only the quality of the research, it also impacts on how we assess research products. The last speaker talked about dwindling funds, challenges about funding in South Africa. It's not just South Africa. Actually, South Africa is doing better than most other African countries, and maybe apart from Rwanda in terms of funding of higher education. But the challenge is still there, that we have a problem of how, first of all, the essence of the state. In Africa, we have a different understanding of what the state is supposed to be about and its purpose, as well as its manifestation in terms of governance, right? The kind of governance notions it produces. States in Africa are not developmental in terms of their purpose, and so the governance that they produce are also parasitic as well as they are exploitative. And so that's how we must understand underfunding of education, higher education. In some instances, like in Nigeria, during the military era, it was very deliberate to underfund higher education for regime security and stability, and we'll find these kind of things all over the place. So let's understand that structure, the underfunding of education, higher education, which impacts on the research, the quality of research that we do in universities. So another barrier is also the quantity of journals. There are not, of course, not enough journals. You would argue there are not enough journals, given the number of researchers we have in Africa. There are not enough journals, journal outlets, to be able to get everyone to try and publish their work on average. And when you talk about the fact that open access has not necessarily yielded higher citations, it has to do also with the number of journals that are available. But then related to this, the quantity, we have seen a lot of journals emerge overnight across the continent. We've seen publishers set up publishing houses from their bedrooms across the continent, and they publish work, But because there are so many journals, and we talk about open access, you see that the quantity of journals would also necessarily affect citations, because there are so many journals, right? But again, another problem with that is that these journals there is a poor quality of these journals. So much as we're saying there are a lot of journals mushrooming, they're actually Mickey Mouse journals, predatory publishing houses, and that also talks about, speaks to the issue of quality of the journals. And so when we talk about quality, we talk about commercialization, which is the driving force behind this Mickey Mouse mushroom journals that publishing houses, that we have all over the place. So it's about profits for them, and because also they are very small. You talked about small journals. There's also inconsistency in terms of publication, regularity of publications, and this comes from the fact that they find it really difficult to get quality peer review for journals. Even the top journals struggle with reviews because we're all busy getting all kinds of things, looking after ourselves, so we forget the essence of why we're academics in the first place. And then, of course, all of these also impact on what I call poor science, and which in itself is an ethical issue. Of course, we can talk about the fact that we have a situation where so many people. So this morning I was in an interview panel where someone who became associate professor in a university somewhere in January is applying to become full professor in another university in what's today? This is August 1st, right? And this person got the job, but this person doesn't have up to 5 years of experience as an academic, as a teacher, in a proper university, teaching, marking scripts, teaching students, engaging. Doesn't have it, but he's going to be a professor at a very young age. It appears to me that universities these days are in competition for who's the youngest professor to have. And I don't mean any disrespect. I'm not talking to you at all, but this is what I find. So there is this competition, this craze, for where people don't do the right things because everybody wants to. So now you don't go through the promotion process properly because you can simply become a full professor through appointment. Okay, you can start in University A, associate professor, the next year, full professor, and you can do all of this in under 3 years. And then the question of course, you can do 1 or 2 quality work, but it does come to hit you at the end of the day. So these are some of the things that impact. And of course, we talk about poor visibility. Some of our journals, and especially the small ones, and even the big ones, don't have websites, and many of them also are not known beyond their disciplinary cycles. Okay, and that's a major challenge. And then we'll talk about the copyright ownership issues. More scholars are beginning to talk about wanting to have rights to the publications that they have published in these publishing houses. These publishing houses don't want to give these rights. Whereas if they were giving these rights, especially after paying hefty APCs, it would have helped to improve accessibility for the ordinary people. Let's not forget that many of the research that we produce are no longer, because of all kinds of media that are available, including even social media, are no longer accessible to just a particular small field of academics. They are now available to everyone who is interested, and so many people are interested, whether you're doing politics on soft power, politics on knowledge production, politics on immigration. Ordinary people in society are interested, and they are beginning to find ways to access these journals. So if you as a researcher are able to put your papers out there on your social media platforms and write them out in simple 1,000 words through semi-academic platforms like the Conversation Africa, you'll get traction, and that increases accessibility, which the publishers don't want for obvious reasons. So these are some of the challenges. In the next 5 minutes, if I have that time, let's talk about inclusive solutions.
3 minutes.
3 minutes, right?
And I'm being generous.
Okay, all right. No, there's going to be a discussion, so I don't have to say everything. But so the first thing is we need to invest in higher education and research deliberately, intentionally, to enable open access. Somebody has to pay, that has to be paid for by government. I like what the United Kingdom have done, and in arguing that we're already paying for this, why should we get our citizens to pay? that makes a lot of sense. And it takes me to my next point, which is that research councils in Africa need to have policies on open access. We don't have any of those policies right now in Africa. If you look at what the UK have done through their own research councils, they've banded together, they have an open access policy, and they are beginning to mandate, journals and publishing houses to adopt that open access policy. And these transformative agreements you talk about, they seem to be working in the United Kingdom, probably because of the open access policy. And I think that's something that we can do. We can talk about, just going beyond a traditional readership focus, expanding social media presence, and explore things like audio publishing, for example, as a way of getting people to access and consume knowledge that are produced in academic journals. I'll stop here so that maybe I will talk more about this during the, discussions.
Okay.
So it's good to hear.
Thank you so much, Professor Isike. I think you've taken us through a robust presentation looking at different dimensions to this issue. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Professor Musawe Kosi.
Thank you very much, Program Director. And thank you also to the previous speakers for opening the conversation. It's always such a challenge for me to be the last speaker, because no matter how well you may have prepared your presentation, you somehow have to, scope your discourse according to your previous speakers. And you will see that I will do a lot of that during my talk. It's also often challenging for me, and I hope you can see me. Unfortunately, those who are here in attendance, I was not gifted vertically. So the Lord gave me many other gifts, just not the height. And I will not be able to move from this platform. Otherwise, we will disadvantage our online audience. So it's also usually challenging for me to have a time limit, because as academics we also tend to speak when we give lectures. You can speak for a very longer period, but I think I'm trying these days to master the art of working within my time constraints, and so I'm also going to try and be very quick. Building on what the previous speakers have said, I think it's very important, first of all, for us to appreciate why we exist as higher education institutions. As scholars, that is researchers, whether you're a student or a full-time academic in the profession, there is a reason why we do what we do. We understand that the world has moved towards a global village in essence. And it's absolutely critical that we continue to play our part and make our contribution to whatever is taking place. I'm sure those of us who keep up to date with the conversation concerning 4IR know how much we have actually lagged behind when it comes to keeping up with this revolution. And it seems to be the narrative over and over that as an African continent, as African countries, we continue to lag behind. And so as scholars, as researchers, the reason why it is important for us to continue to produce this knowledge is so that we're not only consumers, but we are also part of the discourse and we contribute to building the narrative. It's very unfortunate oftentimes when I see research about Africa and about Africans being by authors that you can clearly see have no affiliation to Africa or Africans. And yet we continue to consume that kind of knowledge that is put out there. And our voice is much more minimal compared to the voices and the narratives that we continue to consume from the global perspective. And not to say that they have no right to comment on our issues or matters that affect us as Africans in Africa. However, we should be at the forefront, because I would like to believe that we do not overexert ourselves when it comes to topics that are more Eurocentric or in the global north. And so why do we then continue to be taking a back seat or lagging behind when it comes to disseminating information that pertains to ourselves. We understand then that we have so many challenges, and I'm glad that the topic of this discourse is the barriers, because I often, accuse, some of my students, I say, your implications for practice cannot be shorter than your problem statement, right? But I'm glad that today's discourse is focusing on the challenges, which is what we want to zone in on and highlight, that a lot of these challenges emanate from the fact that as African scholars, we find ourselves with various limitations. And the main limitation stemming from the fact that we always want to jump on the bandwagon of what is happening in the global north. If you look at, for instance, many platforms such as your ResearchGate, your Academia Edu, which are supposedly platforms, right? Which are supposed to create a network of academics and or scholars, accessible to either whether you're consuming the knowledge or producing it. These platforms favor those obviously who are abroad. And it's time that ourselves as Africans and African scholars and communities create such platforms for ourselves where we can share this knowledge. We've already heard about the challenges encompassing open access, and these are some of the ways that we can break through these challenges by creating a network. We talk about the lack of citations, and this is because we rely so much more on external advice or solutions to challenges that are our own. You trust an international scholar's work on African problems more than you would trust an African scholar's perspective on the same challenges. And so it's important that we continue to build these networks. When we look at, and this has already been touched on, the predicament we find ourselves in, and obviously as a young scholar myself, this is a challenge I often face. It's caught between a rock and a hard place. You want to publish in high impact, but you're also very, conscious of the monetary or the pecuniary implications of targeting such high impact journals. I can tell you sometimes, I get nightmares when I think of, some of the journals that as a young academic, I'm happy to have my paper accepted in, but when I think of the daunting task of having to source the finances to pay for it, you can, pay for one publication, $3,000 US. And with the current state, unfortunately, of our African economies and how, the governments are not really able to sustain, and I'm sure we're going to touch on this also during the Q&A about the whole subsidy model and how long-term we have to be honest with ourselves that it's not so sustainable. We cannot over-rely on government. And we need to accept to an extent as well as Africans that we can never compare ourselves at this stage to international, let's say the international community. I mean, if you look at even a place like the US, if you look at a lot of countries in the global north, they are actually already facing their own challenges, even when it comes to research funding and the dissemination of knowledge. And unfortunately, whatever hits them hard will always hit Africa harder at the moment. And these are some of the things that we're trying to change. So we need to accept that at some point we cannot over-rely on the government. What can we do? Can we perhaps invest more in training our scholars to, make those applications for external funding? There are a lot of grants that scholars can access, and it's not easy. But I'm just saying we need to work with what we have and accept the realities and not want to equate ourselves to economies that deem themselves as functional. And this is why at times we end up in a situation where as Africans, because we have reduced ourselves and taken a back seat, I'm sure I'm sorry to bring this up, but I think everyone who either heard about this or encountered it on the internet felt a little demeaned by this. And it was a few weeks ago when African leaders, I'm not going to mention specifically because it's very disheartening, tried to go and facilitate negotiations there, pertaining to the war in Ukraine and Russia. And the type of reception that we get, it is absolutely preposterous. And for the mere fact that we continue, to be perceived as such by the global community, because we choose to take a backseat, we choose to always attach ourselves to what is happening in either in the global north or in other communities, but we hardly, and it's less often that we actually come together and create our own initiatives. So this is actually a conversation that deserves more time, but I'm going to stop here for now because I know that the Q&A will open another can of worms. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Musa Wenkosi, for your presentation. Even though you did not mention some of the buzzwords in South African universities, these days we hear of decoloniality, decolonization. You didn't mention any of those, but your presentation was particularly decolonial. I would now like to open the floor for questions and answers, questions and comments.
Okay. Thank you very much to all the speakers. You raised some very insightful points, and for each one of you, I have a comment. I'll start off with Professor Maria. So you are aware that in the North, a number of members of editorial boards resigned. So you are in the knowledge creation fraternity. I would like to know if this has had an impact on your negotiations and engagements with the major players in the publishing landscape. How are they responding to this?
So sadly, it hasn't impacted us in South Africa enough. So it's obviously impacted it's impacted countries in the global north, particularly in Britain and Germany. And I think that it's actually one of the things that more editors should be doing. I really, on one level, think that we need quite an overhaul of the whole idea of journals and editors. Because as editors, we do the bulk of the work. We get absolutely no reward for it. In most universities, doesn't even feature on our KPIs. And yet we are the ones who are at the coalface of bringing together information, putting together a journal that is coherent, that is of a good standard, chasing people endlessly to be reviewers, and we get nothing for it. So for me, that is one problem. And there is a part of me that thinks that all editors of journals should leave, down tools, and let's do a full-on walkout. And the only thing that's stopping us from doing that is because we know how everybody else's life depends on these journals. So once again, as editors, we're at the coalface and largely doing it for other people. The second thing is I applaud those editors for downing their tools, because the problem is not with the academics, and the problem is not with editors of journals. The problem is with publishers who are charging exorbitant fees to keep themselves in donuts and jam. And then, in South Africa, for example, Elsevier have got a great new author program that they are rolling out, and with varying successes at different universities. But making a free author program with a whole bunch of webinars and some interesting and good speakers does not justify why you charge us what you charge us for your journals. Bring the article processing fees down. This is the big fight that we're having. And then, of course, my other thing that you can hear how animated I get about this.
Yeah.
My other thing that I get totally incensed with is 50% of your journals are now open access. Why are you charging the same cost for subscription? This is making no sense. So we are making headway in South Africa. I'm part of something called SANLIC, which is the consortium that negotiates with the publishers. But we still have a very long way to go. And of course, we have no control over the more independent publishers like MPDI and Oasis, who are also charging what they charge, but their prices are just going up. And so that's another group of sort of publishers that we are going to start negotiating with. But it's a very long road, and there are two major problems with it. One, the rand-dollar exchange, and that hits us so hard. So what we are negotiating for is we want negative. We want a minus 2% decrease, so 2% decrease in what we paid you last year, publishers. And then the second problem with it is our buying power is quite limited in South Africa. So we're not such a big player. It was a very long answer, sorry.
Thank you very much. The second one, Prof, I'll come back to you and then I'll give colleagues an opportunity. It's to Musa. 3,000 is a lot. 3,000 is a lot. I'd like to know your insights about the criteria of what an international journal is. I ask this because I've attended a number of writing workshops, in order to improve my writing, in order to improve chances of your journals getting accepted. And there's talk around tailoring a journal so that it speaks to an international audience. When you go to the journals and you look at their editors, a lot of them are from one country, and one or two from Australia and the other one perhaps from the UK. Is that international? And how then can we write about us and our experiences when we're writing for an international audience? It's something I'd like you to speak about. Thank you.
Do you have a question for Professor Isike?
Yes, it had to
You
do
don't have
with,
to laugh for me.
it had to do with Mickey Mouse.
I wanted to ask all your questions so that I will be able to move to other participants.
Prof, thank you. How do you imagine the change in relationship between the state and universities such that we can work together and change this knowledge production space? My short question. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I like the subject speaks into my PhD research because I looked at the contribution of Professor Chiris Marwala as an African scholar in the theorization of 4IR. So it's amazing to see how there's growing interest towards African scholarship, especially from the global space. But however, even though it's not yet significant, but it does show that there is interest towards African scholarship. The global north is seeking for answers, as the colonial school has already said that they've come to its exhaustion in terms of solving its own problems. So I think there's a huge opportunity for African scholars to air our voices and to come up with solutions, because if we can check the period of COVID in the South, we seemingly have more answers because we've been dealing with pandemics. So yes, I agree with the Prof to say that there is a disregard of our own African scholarship by our own institutions, of which they end up finding comfort from external institutions. So I think we should also, as you said, we should start valuing our own scholarships. We should all start valuing our own knowledge systems and productions. That's my contribution to you. But there is a growing interest to African scholarship in the global space. Yeah.
Professor Yu?
Okay, so I have kind of two sets of observations and comments and questions. One, interestingly, the villain is never in the room. I mean, those people who we should talk to is almost never in the room. So my first set of question is then what we as researchers and academics can do. And I'm thinking of my own experience, and I mean, giving a choice, if I don't need to pay for open access, I will not pay. But I'm thinking of relating to what Prof is saying, that I think now with the whole digital media and whatever, we do actually have ways around it. I actually don't think we necessarily have to pay pay for the paid fee unless we really have to, because I mean, we can publish not open access, and then we use other medias to advertise, and people can request. I mean, that doesn't infringe copyright or whatever. And we can actually promote, and actually the publishers want to see that because they do want people to be interested. So in that sense, I think what I'm saying that we can ask what we researchers can do to go around the problem, because we aren't going to resolve that problem ourselves because we don't have that power. Secondly, what I'm always interested in is like, how does the money come to that money? And I have some interesting kind of observation, which I don't quite understand, frankly. I'm not sure. I hope you guys have some insight to it, but I'm not sure actually whether it's only the people in the industry have insight. One of them is that, again, I always think of to what we compare that with. So then let's think about, I mean, I understand all the kind of the platforms and maintenance and all that stuff, index searching and stuff. But what about preprint? I mean, they have almost exactly, I mean, firstly, I mean, nobody is paying for the reviewer, so there's no that cost. I mean, so it's the same. But they also need to pay for the platform. They also need to do indexing and stuff. So why they can sustain themselves? Why the publishers can't? So that's one part of the question. Secondly, another interesting observation I always kind of laugh about. I mean, you're talking about 3,000. And again, Maria, you're talking about in different fields, there are different charges. And I think in my field, it's also close to about 1,000. That's no. But there are journals who charge more, and there are journals in other fields charge more generally for publishing quicker. So my question is, then what's the difference? Why certain journals, if you pay more, but they charge more, but then they can publish quicker? Like where is the correlation? Because it isn't supposed to be one. And also thinking about mega journals. I mean, for the traditional journals, we understand you have print costs and all that. And for mega journals, they publish so many, they charge so much. I mean, their cost is not lower than 1,000. Actually, the ones that I know, they actually tend to charge about 2,000. So they publish so much, so they will get so much money, but where does the money go? Like from what I understand, actually they have a higher acceptance rate as well. But anyway, like, what is happening with that whole domain? I don't understand.
Okay, there's a question online, and I think it speaks to some of the issues that have been raised already. It's from Shupikai, and he says, what's the logic for one to buy his or her own article when he or she needs it? I think simply asking, why do I have to pay? Does one necessarily have to pay for their publication? So I think I'll start from Professor Mensah-Wenkos.
First question, right?
No, it doesn't have to be based. You've been asked so many questions.
I'm gonna start with the first question I got. So for me, an international community, it depends on what your viewpoint is. For us, of course, when we think of the international community, it's meant to be inclusive of us because we are a part of the international community. But sometimes when the international community, the rest of the international community speak to this aspect, then it sometimes seems to exclude Africa. And so when you're asked to write for the international community, then you need to write in a way that is acceptable, let's say, to the global north, I would say. Sometimes this means tiptoeing around or disregarding even critical aspects which define how we as African scholars do our research. I'll throw in a simple example of even, let's say, the Poppy Act. Now, thanks to the Poppy Act, as researchers, we have to be very careful not to divulge too much, but package our research in a way that will still be valuable to the audience or the community that is going to consume it without making it obvious, let's say, or easy to point out the sample. Especially if you're a qualitative researcher, you will find that this is highly criticized in the international research community or international research journals. Now, it's often a challenge to then explain some of these aspects which constrain you as an African scholar. But if you find, let's say, international journals or, whether it's academic, associate, or editor-in-chiefs who are more open to understanding how also things are done on the other side of the world, then you'll be able to bypass that red tape. But I can tell you sometimes you will not get past that red tape, and they will reduce your research to not being able to conform completely to whatever criteria or stipulations that they have. But it's important that we continue, to fight for our place, because whether the international community likes it or not, Africa is part of this entire, ecosystem. And it's time that we start making our place. If we can't get a place, let's make our own and maybe invite them.
Thank you. Professor K.
All right, so the direct question I was asked is the question of the state and how journals or publishers can work with government. So I will start by saying that I believe that I agree that government can't do everything, right? But I believe in this instance, it is something that government should be doing. Why do I say this? I know that Professor Yes said that, when we look at the numbers, we have to be realistic. Government can't really afford some of these things and it's not sustainable. Well, I agree that, it's not an infinite thing. The pockets of the government are not infinite, but the reason why I believe it is government's responsibility is because I believe that if government has its priority right, it will put its money where its priority is, okay? What is the business of African governments, for example, investing over 60% of their budgets in militaries? All right? We have governments, we've been budgeting monies for defense for 30 years and have never fought one war. Okay, so maybe now in Niger, just as I was reading, the military in Mali and Burkina Faso have threatened ECOWAS that if they try and use force in Niger, they will join, to fight that war. It will be the first time that any of those countries will be having an interstate war since 1960. But if you go check their budgets, you'll find that more than 50% of the budget every year for 30 years went to defense. To defend what? What is security? If you look at security, if the state sees security from the human perspective, then it's going to put it will put a substantial part of its money. I'm not saying 50%, but just the UNESCO minimum of 5%. There are few countries in Africa, I don't want to mention names, that actually do up to 5% of the annual budget on education, not just higher education, but education generally. So imagine if they were to take just a percentage from defense and put it in education, government would be able to fund research, fund higher education in the way that it should. And the issue of, during COVID, you guys knew how solutions from Africa were disregarded, right? Even the one solution that came from South Africa, for example, in terms of being able to put it, to discover the Omicron variant, we instead of praise, we got sanctioned. Yeah. Right? So that's just one demonstration of the inequality in knowledge production and consumption that she was talking about. But isn't it shameful that after 40, 50 years of independence, of higher university education in Africa, we could not produce a vaccine to take care of ourselves. Why was that? Weren't our leaders shameful? Were we not ashamed as a people, as a continent, as a race, that happened? And so if we're ashamed, I think that reflects responsibility, that of government. And if government wants to change that, it needs to start funding research. And one way it can do this is to fund higher education in such a way that it can pay for open access. And then we can begin to find ways amongst ourselves to control the things we can control, like she said, by getting into negotiations around, putting rules and regulations in place, and creating our own knowledge, and maybe cut our degree. When I was a PhD student, I sent an article with my supervisor to a journal, and when it came back, it felt as if I've never been to school. I was shocked. And my supervisor told me, well, that's welcome to the world. This baptism you are going to get until you are a professor. And I'm sure some of you still get your papers rejected by one journal or the other. Not because they are not good enough, but maybe because they don't fall with the scope of the journal. But you have these reviewers who are very, very nasty in terms of the response that he gave. So I said to him, these people appear to be gatekeeping. What do we do? And he said, let's create our own journal. So of course, let's do it. We did, and we created a journal. But the thing is that it's beyond the emotions of the moment. You have to do the work of actually, making the journal sustain over 1 year, 2, 5, 10, 15, 16, 20 years. These so-called journals abroad, one person sat in a room one day, started it, maintained it consistently at personal cost, and then eventually got bought over by Sylvia or Taylor and Francis and Sage. That's how it starts. So we need to start getting to a point where if we value the importance of research and that direction we get from our leaders and in terms of how much they put into our education and research, then we need to sit down and start doing the work so that at a point, people will come to us and will not need to go to them.
Thanks, Professor Maria.
So I think I'm going to pick up on the comments around publishers. So, I mean, one of the big questions that we're all asking ourselves within the libraries world is why are publishers wanting to charge us these exorbitant prices for article processing fees? I can understand an article processing fee of $1,000. I can live with that. But why do we have article processing fees for 120,000 Rand for one article? I mean, what are they doing with this money? And that is something that's part of why we are asking for transformative agreements. A part of what we're asking for is where is this money going and why do you want it? So that's part of what we're asking. And I think that, there are some people who would like to see access to information being completely free. I don't think that is possible. We always have to pay for something somewhere along the way. And then the journals that have got such a quick turnaround time, I would love to know how they do this. There are some journals that I know that pay reviewers, and that definitely helps. So if you do the review within 10 days, we'll pay you 7,000 Rand. So that then raises a whole nother set of questions. Because now if we pay to review, are you going to pay me 7,000 Rand for a bad review or only for a good review? And then we have a whole group of people that are part of that network, and they are the ones getting the money and doing all the reviewing. And it sort of becomes their second job. And that's problematic as well. And so, as my colleague was saying, I mean, one of the problems is that if there isn't a money incentive, it can at times be very difficult for you to get reviews back from academics because people are busy. They don't prioritize this. When really, if you want your journal reviewed, you've got to review other people's. It's a quid pro quo thing, Yeah. But I think this is an incredibly complex landscape
But many journals are doing that now. You send them an article, they send one for you to review. I mean, I think they're kind of doing that kind of stuff.
I do that myself.
Yeah, I do that.
But if I may, just one, I think the one simple answer, is greed. In terms of the amount of monies that these journals collect, and this greed at different levels. In Africa, we have publishing houses that started well to try and compete with these major ones elsewhere in the world. They started well, but eventually got greedy and started charging APCs, and it grew from £200 to 250 to 350, doing the same thing with higher turnovers, like you said, but there's no reflection on what it would mean in terms of cost for people and how that impacts on quality. Because at a point, in some of these publishing houses that I talk about in the continent, if you can pay, you almost guarantee that your paper will be published. And then it gets escalated to other levels at different publishing houses. So I think the word here is commercialization, which comes from greed.
Dr. Akiola.
Just stepped out. Thanks for forcing me to ask this question. The first question I would really like to raise is, what makes a journal predatory? Who determines what journal to put into ISI list, for instance, IBSS or Scopus, for instance? Then is there a way, particularly now that we know that the global north control knowledge and Africa, or let me say generally the global south, are trying to come into this space and create their own knowledge separate from the global north. So can the global south have a different list, different to the ones we have? I know, for instance, South Africa, we have the duet list, and you also know that even within South Africa, that has been relegated to the background. There's an assumption that that's not high impact, and any of the journals on that list are not high impact. And that's my first question. Then another question I want to ask, publishing in the high impact journal in the global north is something that young academics strive to actually. Sometimes you think of African affairs and you want to publish there, despite the fact that what you are writing about is local, but you want to publish in a journal maybe situated in the upper house in New York, United States. How will that knowledge affect the local community in Hinterland, possibly in Burundi, when they don't even have access to what you have published? Thank you.
Okay, any other question before I go to distinguished panelists? Okay, Professor Isike, you talked about gatekeeping earlier. I was wondering if you and any other member of the panel could draw the line between the narrative of gatekeeping and academic laziness. Okay.
Yeah, so that's why when I talk about quality, there's also the question of ethics. Like I talk about poor science also. Sometimes we have scholars who feel that because it's an African journal, you're an African, you have done some research, your work should be published, right? I got someone who wrote our journal to say, I have noticed, and this is because his paper was turned down twice, 2019 and 2021. And this paper was not in my view, the first one in 2019 I did was not good enough to, I was supposed to just reject it. But, and this is where the politics of knowledge again comes in. For some reason, I decided to allow peer reviewers to take that decision, so that I could have. Anyway, it came back rejected, and then I rejected it. Then in 2021, the same person sent another article, and then one of our assistant editors looked at it. His view was that it should not go out. I said, well, this person is important, so take it out. Send out, rejected. And then this person writes a few weeks later to say, I have noticed that people, Black people, from, I don't want to mention the province, because that may give the person's identity away, have not been published in this journal ever. We had to go and do research to confirm what he was saying or not. And then we made it clear to them, look, this it shouldn't have even gone out in the first place. This was poor research. So that kind of person accused us of, interestingly, myself, I'm originally from Nigeria, and I always be seen as such, even though I've lived there for 19 years. The other assistant editor was also not from South Africa, and we're accused of how come people from outside Africa will come to, from Africa will come to South Africa and gatekeep. All right. So we face that kind of accusation. So we now know that all the accusations of gatekeeping are not necessarily questions of gatekeeping. Some of them may be a question of laziness, poor science, poor research. But we then sweep all of them under the excuse of gatekeeping. Doesn't mean that there's no gatekeeping taking place. There is gatekeeping taking place, especially when you write or do research on topics that are that can shift the thinking in a particular discipline. Those who have been on top of that thinking will do everything in their power, to ensure that it doesn't get published. So that does happen, but it's a thin line between laziness and gatekeeping. And I'm suggesting that what we should do, especially if we have government helping us to fund research properly, is for us to also then do the work, the hard work of being ethical, doing a literature scoping, doing our data collection, analyzing them, and putting it out there for peer review.
Well, as we conclude, could you please give your closing remarks as we conclude?
Just to say that you guys are doing a good thing, and I didn't want to talk about the racial component of all of this, because that's also a factor, and there's some gatekeeping there as well, not just in the global north, but also even in South Africa itself. And that's why I was sympathetic to this particular example that I was giving. We went to do the work to confirm if indeed this was correct. So to say that it will be fascinating to hear what you come up with at the end of the whole series in terms of the outputs. So I'll be watching this very keenly, and I want to thank you for the opportunity to do this.
Professor Maria, 2 minutes.
Yeah, so thank you to everybody for the help in organizing this. And I'm really looking forward to the next two sessions and what we will be unpacking there. I think for me, my takeaways are the production and consumption of knowledge will always come at a cost, but that cost needs to be something that is sustainable and something that is realistic. So, some type of article processing fee cost is not a bad thing. But when it is out of all proportion, that is a real problem. And I think that really in Africa, it would be fantastic if governments could actually spend 2% of their budget on research and education.
Thank you very much. Sorry. I would also like to, concur with my fellow speakers. I think it's very important and high time that as scholars in the African community, we do our part. No matter how small, let's just do whatever little we can. And while we really hope that the government continues to do their part as well, we still cannot over-rely on them. And I'll just give a quick example that imagine, if a neighboring country, right, Zimbabwe, if people there decided to rely on government, and I can tell you so many young people have not been afforded even the opportunity to a decent education and had to rely on other means, because that's just life. Sometimes the people you rely on will disappoint you. Even your own parent who's responsible to take care of you may disappoint you, but it doesn't mean you recline to uselessness in life because your parent has not taken their responsibility. So while we trust that the government will continue to do their part, let's also do our little parts, however we can. Thank you.
Okay, colleagues, on behalf of the Institute for the Future of Knowledge and the University of Johannesburg's library, I would like to thank our distinguished speakers for their excellent contribution. And I would also like to thank our distinguished audience for their thought-provoking questions and comments. I would like to invite you to join us for the part 2 of this seminar series next week, Tuesday. Thank you. We hope to see you next week.
The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.